You know, when you see a picture of a Japanese castle, those amazing white walls, the big tower, you just know there's a whole story there, right? More than just a pretty building.
Oh, absolutely. There's so much strategy and history packed into them.
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today. We've got a bunch of really interesting sources, lined up stuff from the Japan National Tourism Organization, articles on construction, overviews, pieces on how their role changed.
Even academic papers comparing them to British castle towns and specifics like the Haiju Edict. It's a good mix.
Right. So the plan is to kind of unpack all that, get past the surface level, and really understand how they were built, what they were for, and how they changed over time.
Basically, a shortcut to appreciating the thinking behind these incredible structures. The strategy, the culture, it's all there.
Okay, so where do we start? Way back. These things didn't just appear fully formed, I assume.
Definitely not. The earliest stuff, you're looking at much simpler things, like basic wooden stockades using hills and natural features. Sources mention kugoishi, these early earthworks, and also the ainuchashi.
So more like temporary defenses, not permanent power bases.
Pretty much. Leveraging the land, maybe for a specific threat or season, nothing like the grand castles we picture later on.
Okay, but then things evolved. We get the rise of the daimyo, the feudal lords, and things start getting more serious, right? Enter the mountain castles.
Exactly, the Yamajiri. Now you see a real step up. They're actively shaping the terrain, digging big ditches, diverting streams to make moats, really using those mountains.
Ah, okay. So getting more complex, but still mostly wood and thatch construction at this point.
Yeah, that's the key thing, wood and thatch, which meant, instability and the constant threat of fire. That was a major weakness.
Right. But then comes the Sengoku period, the warring states. That must have changed everything.
Oh, massively. Castles become these central hubs of power for the daimyos. They get bigger, more complex, and you start seeing castle towns jukamachi growing up around them. They weren't just forts anymore.
And location became even more crucial, I bet. Not just high ground, but controlling the important routes.
Absolutely. Along trade routes, main roads, rivers. Controlling the flow of goods and people was vital. Strategy wasn't just about defense, it was about control.
And then later in the Sengoku period, there's another shift, like castles become status symbols too. I saw Oda Nobunaga's Azuchi Castle mentioned as a big deal.
Yes, Azuchi is often seen as a turning point. It had the very first proper tenshu, the main keep. It wasn't just about defense anymore. Nobunaga built it to impress, to intimidate rivals with its size, its really elegant interiors, power projection.
Okay, so the Tenshi starts there, and Azuchi was what, a mix of mountain and plain style?
Yeah, sort of a hybrid, and this lines up with a huge technological change, the arrival of firearms in the mid-1500s.
Ah, guns. That must have forced a total rethink.
Completely. Suddenly, those older wooden walls weren't enough. Walls needed to be much thicker, stronger, often stone-faced to handle gunfire. This is when you really see the development of those impressive plains castles.
Like Himeji, the famous White Heron Castle.
Exactly like Himeji. It's a prime example of that evolution. Still incredibly defensive, but also just a magnificent statement, built to withstand new threats, but also to showcase the Lord's power and wealth.
The defenses in those layer castles sound incredibly sophisticated, like layers upon layers.
Oh, they were. Multiple moats sometimes. Those curving stone walls, ishigaki, that are incredibly hard to climb, especially with the overhangs.
And the entrances. The sources mentioned deliberately confusing paths, dead ends.
Yeah, the nawabari, the overall layout or site planning, it was crucial. Himeji is a masterclass. It's designed to completely disorient attackers. Twisting paths, sudden drops, switchbacks. You'd get lost trying to even find the main keep.
It's like a deadly maze.
Yeah.
And they had specific holes in the walls for shooting from.
Uh-huh. The sama, they had different types of sama for arrows, and then teppasama, specifically designed for firearms, much wider openings. There were even rarer taihosama for cannons, though cannons weren't as central as in European siege warfare.
And you mentioned liking those chutes for dropping rocks?
Huh. Yeah, well, maybe not liking them if I were attacking, but from a design perspective, ingenious. Chutes positioned over key points to drop rocks, or even boiling water or sand on anyone trying to scale the walls. Simple, but effective.
Brutal. Okay, so let's talk more about that main tower, the Tenshu. It started as an observation post, you said.
Initially, yes, often quite simple. But influenced by Azuchi, it evolved into this multi-story symbol of the daimi's power. The construction itself was interesting, too.
How so?
They often used techniques similar to building temples or pagodas, sometimes with a central pillar helping to stabilize the structure, especially against earthquakes. And the decorations, the roof lines, it was all designed to emphasize height, grandeur, power.
And the stone walls, the shigaki. The fact they use dry masonry is fascinating. No mortar.
Right, largely because of Japan's frequent earthquakes. Mortared walls are too rigid. Dry stone walls allow for some movement without collapsing. It's an adaptation to the environment.
So they just fit the stones together.
Precisely. You see different styles. Early mountain castles might use ransekizumi, kind of random-looking piles of natural stones. Later, techniques like gobozumi used huge, carefully placed boulders embedded in the wall for stability and flexibility.
And that curve you often see. Is that just for looks?
Not entirely. The curvature, especially near the base, added structural integrity, again, helping dissipate earthquake forces. And then you have the mushigaeshi.
Ah, yes, the warrior repellent walls, like a Kumamoto castle. Super steep at the bottom.
Exactly. Almost impossible to get a foothold to climb. Plus other defenses like places for gunners, arrow slits, sometimes stores of hot sand, layers upon layers.
It's interesting, though, that one source mentioned Japanese castle walls didn't usually surround the whole town, unlike in Europe.
That's a key difference. European castles often enclose the town within outer walls. In Japan, the Jukamachi, the town, was usually outside the main castle defenses. The core compound was for the lord and his samurai retainers. The town defense was secondary.
Okay, so inside the main walls, how was it laid out? The sources talk about different baileys or courtyards.
Yes, the maru or kurwa. You typically have the central bailey, the anmaru, where the tenshu and often the lord's residence were. Then surrounding that, the ninomaru, second bailey, sanamaru, third bailey, and maybe even outer ones like a sotogaruwa.
And the layout depended on the land.
Heavily. Topography dictated the shape and arrangement. But the gates and the paths connecting these baileys were crucial defensive elements.
Oh, so more mazes.
Pretty much. Complex gate systems, like the Masugata style with a square courtyard between an outer and inner gate, forced attackers into tight spots, exposed them to fire from defenders on the walls above. The path to the tenshu was almost always indirect, often spiraling upwards.
Constantly under attack from above. Okay, and these castles weren't just forts, right? People lived there.
Yes, the lord and his family, key retainers. The goten, or palace buildings, were the residential and administrative centers, often quite elaborate inside, reflecting the lord's status.
And the Tenshu itself, was it just a lookout and final refuge?
It served those roles, definitely, but also often as a storehouse for valuables, weapons, food supplies, especially in peacetime. And some lords, like Nobunaga at Azuchi, actually lived in the Tenshu, making it a combined keep and palace.
So the outside appearance might not even show the real number of floors inside.
Sometimes, yes. The external design focused on appearance and defense could be misleading about the internal layout.
Okay, so this complex system reaches its peak and then peace breaks out.
Yeah.
The Edo period.
Right. 2.5 centuries of relative peace under the Tokugawa shogunate. This dramatically changes the role of castles.
How did they change? Less focus on defense.
Defense was still a consideration, mainly against potential peasant uprisings or internal strife, but their primary roles shifted. They became more administrative centers, symbols of the daimyo's status and wealth within the shogunate system. Architecture might become even more elaborate, but the hardcore military function lessened.
And the shogunate controlled how many castles could exist.
Yes. A major policy was one province, one castle, limiting each Han domain to a single castle, with some exceptions. This meant many castles were deliberately dismantled during the early Edo period. It was about centralizing power.
Okay. Fast forward a couple of centuries. The Meiji Restoration happens, end of the shogunate.
Yeah.
What happens to the remaining castles then? They must have seemed like symbols of the old regime.
Exactly. They were seen as relics of feudalism. The new Meiji government issued the Haiju Edict in 1873, basically, an order for the disposal of castles.
Disposal, like tear them down.
Many were torn down, sold off, materials repurposed. Some became government offices, schools, military barracks. It's quite shocking to think about now how close many came to being completely lost.
What stopped the complete destruction?
Thankfully, a growing awareness of their cultural and historical values started to emerge, partly influenced by European ideas about heritage preservation. People like Max von Brandt, a German diplomat, argued for preserving Nagoya Castle, for example. Tourism potential was also recognized.
So a shift in perspective again.
Yes. And eventually, laws were passed to protect them, like the National Treasures Law in 1929. But then came another threat,
World War II.
World War II. Some castles were used by the Imperial Japanese Army. Osaka, Hiroshima, Kanazawa housed military facilities. This made them targets.
So many main towers were destroyed by bombing.
Sadly, yes. Including Hiroshima Castle, which was obliterated by the atomic bomb. And Shuri Castle in Okinawa was actually the site of intense fighting, the last castle attacked by an invading force.
A really tragic chapter. What about after the war? Reconstruction.
Yes, significant efforts began. Some reconstructions used modern materials like steel-reinforced concrete for speed and structural reasons. Think Osaka Castle's main keep.
But not all.
No, especially more recently, there's been a strong movement towards using traditional materials and techniques where possible. Kanazawa Castle's restoration work is a great example of that commitment to authenticity.
And incredibly, some originals survived everything.
Yes, there are 12 castles with their original tenshu still standing. They somehow avoided fires, edicts, earthquakes, and wartime bombing. Remarkable survivors.
12 originals. Wow. And the rest? Ruins, parks.
A mix. Many sites are ruins, some beautifully maintained within parks, others just marked historical sites. It's a whole spectrum.
So thinking about their broader significance, they weren't just military, right? They shaped society around them.
Absolutely. They were centers of government, sure, but also economic engines. Castle towns had markets, artisans, there were hubs of activity, and cultural centers too, places for tea ceremonies, no theater, art.
They really embodied the daimyo's power and legitimacy.
In every sense, visually, politically, economically.
And comparing them to European castles, the sources highlighted some key differences again. Wood versus stone mainly.
That's a big one. Japanese castles relied heavily on wood, with stone foundations and walls being key, whereas European castles went all in on stone much earlier and more extensively.
And the town layout difference we mentioned.
Right. European towns often clustered inside castle walls for protection. Japanese jukumachi were typically outside the core defenses, though often planned and zoned.
High walls less common too, because of earthquakes.
Yes, massive, sheer stone curtain walls like you see in Europe were less practical. Moats and complex earthworks, plus those sophisticated ishigaki, were the primary barriers, along with the internal maze-like structure.
And those castle towns. The planning sounds fascinating. One source called them assembled towns.
Yes, often meticulously planned. Streets laid out defensively, different districts assigned to samurai of different ranks, merchants, artisans, reflecting the social hierarchy.
Wow.
Functional and social zoning adapted to the landscape.
And that structure sometimes lasted into modern times.
Amazingly, yes. The footprint of the old jukumachi often influenced the development of the modern city that grew up on the site. You can sometimes still trace the old zones.
Incredible lasting impact. Okay, so wrapping this up. Japanese castles were clearly so much more than just fortresses.
Definitely. They were dynamic, evolving structures reflecting warfare, politics, culture, sophisticated defenses, powerful symbols, and now, thankfully, important heritage sites.
They really tell a story about Japan's history.
A very rich and complex one.
So here's something to maybe leave our listeners thinking about. We've talked about the strategic thinking layered defenses, adapting to the land, projecting authority. How might those core ideas still be relevant today?
Interesting question. Not in a military sense necessarily.
Right, but maybe in business, urban planning, even how we approach complex problems. That idea of layered security, understanding your environment, making a strong impression.
It's true. The principles of anticipating threats, controlling flow, using psychology, you could argue they translate, adapting ancient strategies to modern challenges.
Something to chew on. Maybe it makes you want to visit one. Or just look at familiar structures in a new way. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.